right, we're gonna rehydrate our sourdough starter. I have my dried starter here, the little chips in this jar. This is the perfect size jar to use. This is 1 liter wide mouth jar. You're gonna need that because you're gonna be putting lots of stuff in, so nice and wide. This is the perfect size, so throw your chips in here, crush them up as much as you can before. You can use a mortar and pestle, or you can throw them in the blender too. And then you're just gonna set them on your scale, tare your scale, and you're going to be adding about 15 grams of water. It's okay if you go a little bit over, a little bit under, that's okay. It's a very small amount of water. And what we're going to be doing with this first little bit of water, this 15 to 20 grams of water, is we're just going to let the chips hydrate, so soak that water up, and then we'll have a bit more of a paste. So we're just going to kind of break our chips up as much as we can right now. It's not the easiest to do. Just break them up, and then we're just gonna let them soak. And we're gonna let them soak for a few hours, and we'll come back and take a peek at them, and then we'll stir them up a little bit more. They should be easier to stir then, and we'll take a look. So nothing to see here. We'll come back in 20 minutes or in 2 hours and see how it's doing then. All right, so it's been 2 hours, and we're just looking at our starter now again, and you can see it's softened. All the chips have softened quite a bit. So I'm just gonna start by giving this a stir. And just breaking up those chips even a little bit more if we can. And mine are still quite chunky, but nevertheless, we're going to keep going. So as I stir this around, I do start to see some bubbles in my liquid there. I don't know if you can see that. But it's quite chunky still. That's totally okay. We're going to throw it on our scale, and we're going to do our first feeding. Now to feed our sourdough starter, all we need to do is add flour and water. That's all our sourdough starter is comprised of. And so to keep it happy and keep it alive, we just need to give it more flour and more water. So we're going to add 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. A little bit extra water there, so I'm going to just even it out here with a little bit more flour. There we go. So the main thing is you want equal parts water and flour. And then all we're going to do is just give this a good mix. And we should get kind of a thick paste. So there's my paste. So you see it's not too thick, but it's not super liquidy either. We just want to stir this until sort of it's combined as much as possible. And then we're going to leave it overnight, just like this. I'm going to cover this with a piece of fabric and an elastic. And I'm going to ignore this for 15 hours. So it's about 6 p.m. now, and I'm not going to look at this again until about 9 a.m. So when we come back in the morning, we're going to observe it again. But right now, if I smell this, it smells just like fresh flour. It smells really good. When I come back in the morning, it's going to have a bit more of a yeasty smell. So we'll see that, but we'll see you again in about 12 to 15 hours to come back and revisit our starter. All right, we're back. It's been just over 15 hours. It's been about 16 hours for me since I last looked at this. So it is flexible in the timing, so don't worry too much about that. And when I take this off here, I don't see much has changed. I got this thick, gooey paste. There's 2 or 3 little tiny bubbles. I'm not seeing a lot of action around the outside in terms of bubbles. And when I smell it, it still smells like fresh flour mostly, but there's a little hint of sourness, not very much. So what we're going to do this time is we're going to feed this 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. So a little bit more than our last feeding. And then again, we're just going to ignore this for 12-ish hours. Okay. Okay, we're going to give this a good stir. And I always keep my starter when I'm trying to use it or activate it on the counter because that just is the warmest spot as opposed to being in the fridge where we can ignore it a little bit more. So keeping it on on the counter will help get it activated. You can even move this to like a warm spot. Like there's a spot right beside my fridge, or on top of the fridge is usually warm, or just, you know, sort of just out near the stove if you're cooking, that kind of thing. And that'll help it get active too, the heat, the warmth. You don't want to get it hot, but just warm. So here we go, nice sticky paste again. Nothing too exciting there. But we're just gonna, again, leave this, cover it. And the reason why we cover it is because we wanna keep fruit flies get really attracted to the smell of sourdough. So we wanna keep any fruit flies out, or just any like cat hair, dog hair, anything that might be in your house that might float into it, because it is so sticky. Once it's in, it's in. So just keeping it covered with cloth, and not with a lid, because as it starts to get active, it'll start to produce gas. And if we put a lid on something that's producing gas, we might have a little bit of a ticking time bomb in our hands. So I like to use a cloth to just keep mine safe. And you can use anything you have laying around the house. This is just a scrap piece of fabric for me. People have used all kinds of things, so get creative with what you use, and just keep it covered to keep things out. And so I'll check back in with you guys in about 12 hours, and we'll see how our starters are doing. All right, my starter's been on the counter for about 12 hours, and I moved this to a really warm spot. It's been a little less than 12 hours, about 9 hours actually. So ideally we'd let it go for the full 12 or even a little longer. And at this point I should say, this is the part where you start to feel like you're crazy because nothing is happening. So that's normal, you're right on track. When I look into this, when I smell this, it still just smells like fresh flour to me. There are a couple bubbles, but really nothing too much to speak of. So what we do at this stage is we get a little spare bowl here, and we pour most of it out. And this is called discarding and feeding, because when we feed our starter, we have to feed it proportionate to how much we already have. So when we have a lot, we need to feed it like a lot. So we always want to feed a small amount of starter, as opposed to always feeding more and more and more. Then we'll have to be feeding it increasing amounts, increasing quantities. So really, we just take it all down to just a couple tablespoons, just what lines the wall of our jar. So not very much, just enough to coat the bottom once I push it back down. So we really don't need much to keep going. And then we're gonna turn our scale on and we're gonna feed it again 100 grams of both flour and of water. More. Great. Perfect. So I actually got a little bit, I always do this, I always get a little bit too much water, so I'm gonna add a little bit more flour here just to compensate. Great. And then we'll use our knife and we'll just stir this in just like before. And this time I'm gonna leave it on the counter overnight, and it'll be an extended 12-hour period. So it'll be about closer to 15 hours again. But then when I come back in the morning, it should really be nice and bubbly. The best thing you can do when you're waiting in between these feedings and discardings is really just have patience. So if there's no bubbles in the morning, it's not a big deal. We just have to repeat this step exactly again. But I will touch base with you in the morning and update you on my starter and how it's going, and hopefully your starter will be getting some nice action soon. So, nothing too much to see there. We've seen this before. I'm going to cover this. I'm going to keep it in a warm spot next to my fridge overnight, and we'll check back in the morning. Alright, it's the morning of day 3, and one thing I did here before I left this, after I shut off the video, was I put an elastic around where my sourdough starter was when I fed it. And this morning when I woke it up, you can see it's risen up just a little bit above my elastic here. I see lots of tiny bubbles in there, but nothing too exciting. So just want to smell it. It is starting to smell a little bit more yeasty, so it's moving away from that fresh floury smell. It still smells fresh, but it smells a little bit more yeasty this morning. So you could wait a little longer with this, let it go 18 hours and then use it to make your bread, or you could discard and feed again. And that's what I'm going to do, because I'm going to use this discard. It's a little bit more active today, so I'm going to use this discard to make some waffles, sourdough waffles this morning. So I'm going to pour, again, the same step as before. So pouring all but 2 teaspoons into a bowl or out of the jar. These are going to make some delicious waffles. And I love to use like sourdough discard for crepes or waffles. There's not very much in there. You can see it's just kind of stuck to the side of the walls. We're going to pop this back on our scale. Set my knife over here for a second. And we're going to do the same thing as before, which is 110 grams of flour and 110 grams of water. Now the reason why I have put to do 110 grams of each is because the recipe that I often use calls for 220 grams of starter. So by putting in 110 of each, it gives us 220. So one of the things we'll talk about is how you want to feed your starter just what you need, no more. Because you can easily get a lot of starter. And then it becomes hard to like know what to do with it. So not all of us eat waffles every day, but although that might be nice too. All right, perfect. Take our knife, give this a stir, and this time I do want you to also put an elastic around your jar where your starter is sitting at once you've stirred it all in. So I'm going to stir this in and then adjust my elastic. And this is just one way to track how much it's rising. So it helps to kind of give us a visual cue. But once this really starts to take off, we'll really start to see all the bubbles kind of coming up in it. So we'll check back in on this in about 12 hours and see how it's doing. And I imagine by then it's going to be really bubbly. So we'll wait and see. So just kind of press it flat, because otherwise it'll be very hard to get your elastic around the right spot. There we go. My elastic is pretty close already because it's about the same amount that we had yesterday. So just adjust it a little bit. So generally speaking, your starter should double in size if you are discarding and then feeding, okay? So this is gonna go back into my warm spot and I'll check in with you in about 12 hours. All right, we're back and I have my sourdough starter here. So you can kind of see, let me put this right in the camera for you, that our sourdough starter has risen to about here. You can see a few more bubbles in the sides here. Let me try and block the light so you can see those little bubbles a bit better. You can see bubbles underneath too. Let's see if this will focus. And one thing I want to point out is that this has risen twice in size. It's starting to smell really good. It's smelling like fresh yeast. It doesn't smell like flour anymore, and that's a distinct change that we want to see in our sourdough starters. I'm going to show you the inside here. You can see there's quite a bit of bubble action in there. You can see as I turn it, it really pulls on those bubbles. It's quite a goopy, sticky, thick paste, but we can see it's full of bubbles and we can see it's really risen a lot. So it's more than doubled. So this starter is now ready to use. It's been less than 12 hours. It's about 6 o'clock here now. So I did it this morning at about 9. So less than 12 hours until it was ready to use. So now we can use this to start mixing our dough, and that's what I'm going to do. I used our discard this morning for some delicious sourdough waffles, and this is going to become sourdough pizza. So once you have your starter, at this stage, it's good to use. So what I always encourage people to do is just start. Just pick a recipe and try it. You got to kind of release your expectations, go with the flow, trust your gut, embrace curiosity, and don't be afraid of it. It's the worst case scenario, you get a flatbread, but that's totally okay and totally normal in the learning journey. So go ahead and start baking with this now, and tag me in your posts as always and keep me posted on how you're doing. Good luck.